Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Phrames. Good to be back with all of you. I'm your host, Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King. Darren, it's been an exciting and emotionally and energetically volatile week in America. And I know you and I have been very excited to get together and talk about the things that are going on, both in the world and in the world of ufology. But before we do all of that, I want to do what we usually do, kind of catch up with where we are in our own lives. It's been a stressful week for me, and I think our community in Asheville. Just a lot of stuff continuing to go on in that regard, rebuilding. Every day I'm getting some sort of new footage that's shared with me about the devastation, and whether it be drone footage or someone who's ventured out down a road that is impassable and is sharing what they're seeing over there. There's still just a lot of widespread damage here that has impacted the community. And what this does to me, and I'm sure to many, is it brings these waves of emotion. You kind of go through these periods where you go through the motions of what you're used to doing, your work life, in my case, my kids going to school, and just the routines of life. And then you are hit with these reminders of just how dramatic this storm was here in our community. And so you have all of that. It's been several weeks now since that disaster occurred. And obviously it's not done. It's continuing to be a lived disaster for many people. So you have all of that. And on top of that, and in the Asheville community, it is a very left-leaning community. And you have this election in the U.S. that I think really surprised a lot of people here with the direction that it went. So you've got this trauma that was already kind of it felt very real in our bones, and now for many it's amplified by these new sort of directions that the country appears to be going in. So it's not been the most calm week. I wish I could say I've been super chill, but I haven't. I did have some bright moments in the week, though. Getting to hang out with you for pizza earlier in the week was really nice, and we hadn't done that in quite some time, so that was really good to do. And then my son is in the band at the high school, got to go to a high school football game last night and watch them perform, and that was great, just to be with members of the community and do something that felt a little like normal. And so all that stuff has been in my mix, but what's been going on with you?
Well, it's been interesting for me too. As you kind of alluded to there, we've had numerous shocks to the system that people are having to metabolize, is the word I like to use. And to some degree, at some point, you kind of have shock fatigue where you can only absorb so much shock, and at some point it becomes this whiteout in people's perception, and they kind of just go into a kind of frozen configuration. So I'm seeing a lot of people, especially after the political shock of this week, who seem like they are people who are recovering from trauma. And I see that in their expressions, in their diminished emotional range, things like this. So I'm definitely noticing this. It was interesting because my expanding awareness class was held on Tuesday night. So it was the night of the election. And on the one hand, I looked forward to that opportunity because I always say in my classes that it's one thing to talk about working with energy when it's conceptual and cerebral, but when you're feeling it in your body, it's present. That's when you really have the opportunity to learn to work with it. So there was plenty of energy present that night. And so we did work with some of that. Now, you mentioned we got together for pizza on Monday. That was definitely great. And that was the first time I've been back in Asheville since the Helene storm. So on the one hand, you have this kind of strange situation where some parts of the city you don't notice much difference. And I remember driving in going, I don't really see anything yet. But then when I went down to the River Arch District, for instance, it looked like a war zone. And I was seeing trash way up in the trees, which told me at some point the water level was up there, which was almost unfathomable. And so it makes you realize that even in America, we've seen this transition to where these old mill districts are being turned into artistic and cultural centers. And people like the idea of being able to walk along a river. Of course, the challenge is when you have a situation like this storm dumping trillions of gallons of water, those are the first to get washed out. So definitely noticed huge differences depending on where you were and how close you were to water. And this partly brought back memories of the tsunami that happened in the early part of the millennium, where you kind of have this notion of water being this spiritual kind of, peaceful kind of thing. But then you see when it's turned into this kind of wrathful thing that is destructive. Like I remember literally thinking on Monday that I might get lunch at Moe's, which is down by Biltmore Village. Went there and the building's hardly there anymore. It's pretty much demolished, right? So to think that water can do that was really impacting on me. So yeah, it's been a crazy week, absolutely. And as you and I were discussing before we started recording, there's so many consequential elements in our society, in our civilization right now, that it becomes difficult to even track them all. And yet that's one thing I try to do, is hold open a spacious enough understanding and awareness that I can track them and see how they're interacting. Because, of course, the political shifts here are causing political ramifications in Europe and around the world. So there's a lot going on. And as we'll get into today, this does raise questions from a ufological perspective of how much attention span does the public have left to engage with disclosure and what seems to be emerging in terms of evidence for ufology, because just so much else is going on.
That's right. And we've had many weeks now to anticipate momentum in the UFO conversation. And a lot of people before the election were saying, well, it's going to be difficult to see momentum because of the election. Well, the election is now behind us, and obviously that's brought with it some unexpected surprises, at least for some people, and a new political landscape as we have a new administration, getting ready to come into power. And so we've got that transitional period occurring. But we do very much have UFO topics that are being discussed. So I want to touch on some of those moments that have been in the conversation in the last couple of weeks. And maybe I'll start with one that I think got quite a lot of controversy. And this was an image that Lou Elizondo had shared during one of his roadshow talks. He's been doing these community roadshow conversations in, I want to say, kind of smaller cities in the U.S., just to get out there and talk with the American people and share his experiences and that kind of thing. So he put up an image that he said had been provided to him by another intelligence source, and this was purportedly an image of a mothership in the clouds, this light underneath this large disc-shaped object. And very quickly, as the internet often does, the sleuths went to town on this image and discovered that, no, this really wasn't a mothership. This was, in fact, a reflection off of a pane of glass from someone who was inside a room, and the reflection was this lamp, this behind them above their head. And that, I think, kind of served as a shock to some that this would happen, that someone like Elizondo, with his pedigree and background, would have put forth an image like this and not properly had vetted it beforehand to see that it might not be genuine. I thought he did the right thing, and very quickly, once this was noted to be misinformation about it being a mothership, he owned up to that mistake, and he very publicly apologized and kind of doubled down his commitment to being transparent and trying to continue to push for this subject. But nevertheless, Darren, I think some damage was done to Elizondo, his reputation, a little bit. Maybe not from those that are his ardent supporters, which I certainly am a supporter of his efforts, but for those who may have seen him as new to the subject, but really this proponent of the UFO as something being real, but they maybe wanted an excuse to say, I don't know, I'm not fully sure this is real. So if you have an event like this happen, you've got the people who are kind of on the fence that may go back and say, I don't know, I'm not going to get the wool pulled over my eyes here. So I don't know, what were your thoughts on that sort of situation? And he's obviously continuing to get out there and talk with the people, so I appreciate that he's not given up.
Well, like you said, I appreciate that he owned it right away when it happened, and he acknowledged that he made a mistake, and that is a human tendency. To err is human, as they say. But yeah, the challenge is a lot of people that are kind of more on the fence suddenly lost a lot of faith, because we undoubtedly have a lot of this coming down to the opinions being expressed by these people who have purportedly seen these images, seen footage. We hear about the 22-minute footage that's really, really compelling. So people like Chris Mellon and Lou Elizondo have said, I've personally seen footage that is incredibly compelling, meaning that it's above reproach, that it is clear evidence of something that is not human technology. And then when you hear one of these same people falling for lack of a better expression, a reflection of a lamp, for a lot of people that are on the fence, they suddenly lose a lot of faith. And of course, to the detractors, to the debunkers, this is fuel for the fire, right? And they go to town on this and just point out that this could be the case across the board. It's unfortunate, and this is kind of something that will happen as we go along. I remember when I first saw that image, I thought, that looks a bit iffy to me, without me ever being able to recognize that it was a lamp reflection. Just because, again, these beings, this intelligence seems to be able to control even how we capture the footage and whatnot. And so for something to be through someone's front window that large in the clouds, and something about the way the reflection was happening in the clouds looked a bit off to me, and I know other people have acknowledged the same thing. So it is unfortunate. It does move us a step back, but in the big picture, there are bigger things to worry about in terms of us moving towards disclosure.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And speaking of a big picture momentum topic that's coming up, we've got this UAP hearing happening in the House in just a few days on the 13th, so Wednesday of this coming week. We're going to have a House hearing, and the witness list has been published. So we know that Tim Gallaudet's going to be there, retired Rear Admiral Tim Gallaudet. We've got journalist Michael Schellenberger who's going to be there as well. And then we have Lou Elizondo, and we also have Michael Gold, who used to be with NASA, but also used to work with Bigelow Aerospace. Very interesting lineup there. I think people have mixed reactions to this too, at least what I'm seeing in social media. We've got some folks that are excited and think this is further momentum, moving this topic in a good direction. And we've got others that are like, I don't know, are we going to hear anything new? We were really hoping for a firsthand witness. I'm not necessarily thinking that one of these four individuals is a firsthand witness from what we know about them. A little less is known about Michael Gold than maybe the others, as he's had fewer, I think, public appearances. But the fact that he is connected to Bigelow and NASA provides a bit of a mixed bag, because there is the debunker narrative about Bigelow and the inner circle of people tied to Bob Bigelow being these yarn spinners who've been pushing this narrative that there's this UFO thing there, and actually none of it exists. So it's just this inner circle of folks that keep kind of pushing this narrative forward. So it'll be interesting. Obviously, it hinges a lot on the length of the hearing, the questions that are asked during the hearing, what they're allowed to say, what information is entered into the official record. That's also, I think, a really important point to make here, as we all remember that the Wilson Davis memo was entered into the record at the last hearing. And I think that was certainly significant and consequential. So we're going to be keeping our eyes peeled for this. I know a lot of attention will be on it, and we'll certainly be talking about it the next time we get together. So what are your feelings about the hearing? What are you looking to see? Do you think this is going to move the needle further, or are you maybe going to take a neutral position on this before it actually takes place?
Well, first thing I would say is I'm always happy when a hearing of this nature is being held, regardless. It's always a good thing. It's never a negative thing. How much it will actually move the ball down the field, the proverbial ball down the field, remains to be seen. And I am somewhat reserved in my expectations there. Because when you look at this witness list, like you said, we keep hearing about these 40 whistleblowers. And clearly that doesn't seem to be who's going to be involved here. And of course, we always have to temper our expectations with the notion that this is an unclassified hearing. So anything that is really juicy is going to be classified and can only be heard in a SCIF. And as we've discussed on previous episodes, can only be heard in a SCIF by Congress people who are cleared to hear that information. So you have elements on both sides that have to work for this to happen. So, for instance, the Gang of Eight could hear this, but not just any congressperson can hear this. So that should temper our expectations. We, of course, also saw a bit of a kerfuffle around Chris Mellon, because Chris Mellon mentioned that while he would like to be there and he was asked to be there, he had a previous commitment that he had to go to. And of course, this led almost like a revolt on social media, people saying, get your priorities straight. You know, this is world-changing stuff. Why would you not be there? And he made the point that it's kind of preposterous to have that reaction. If he thought that him being there would make a significant difference, he would make a priority of being there. Now, on top of that, Lou Elizondo, of course, we recently had his book. We've had his comments for years now. I think we're just going to see, like what you pointed to, maybe this taken down for the record, the official record. But I don't think we're going to hear anything new there. With people like Schellenberger, I've heard some caution and some concern even about him being involved, because while he has broken some news for sure, I've heard from some of my sources that some of what he's leaked is actually false information. So that raises questions about just like what happened with the misidentification of the lamp. If you have some incorrect information that's going into these kinds of conversations, it can actually put a damp towel on the whole thing in terms of moving forward. So you really do want to make sure that the people speaking, giving testimony, really know their stuff, are really above board, and is having a journalist who's an independent journalist really that person. I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing that he's testifying, but it's not the kind of gold standard I think we might hope for. And it was someone like Michael Gold, I would say that my sense of him is that he's one of these guys who maybe was part of the conversation we should have been having 5 years ago, in terms of there seems like there might be something there. We should at least start analyzing this. We should document this. We should gather data around this. But he doesn't seem like a guy who's fully convinced of what this is, and now we're talking about the fine-tuning of it. So he'll say things like, there seems to be some sort of phenomenon going on, but we don't know exactly what it is. And he expressed frustration. I'm not even sure what we're measuring for. Is this radar signatures? Is this techno signatures? So he seems to be, again, kind of someone who's middle of the road there, who's at least lobbying that NASA should be involved to track some of this, but is quite conservative publicly so far in terms of what he's saying he thinks it means ultimately. Like you said, it is good to have someone from NASA there, but at the same time, those of us within ufology are very cautious about any optimism assigned to NASA, because the general sense is that at least a certain contingent of NASA knows a lot about this, has known about it for decades, and is just not being clear with the public. So it feels like misdirection to even have NASA there acting like they're just beginning to look into this kind of investigation. So I would say my expectations are quite tempered, and that probably even increased when I saw the witness list. So that's what I would say about what I'm looking forward to this week. It's a good thing. We, at least if nothing else, hope that this raises awareness amongst Congress people and that it keeps some of the momentum going. But this is not going to be a groundbreaker, I think, the way some people were maybe hoping for.
That's my thinking as well. I do think it reflects that we are seeing a lessening of the stigma. We're in a place now, I feel, where most people are really comfortable talking about this. Certainly, if you listen to a lot of the politicians on the right and the podcasts on the right, like they're all very vocal about being interested in this and trying to get to the bottom, and it kind of gets lumped into that category of the government's been hiding secrets from the American people, and we want to squash that and make it transparent and tell the American people what it knows, and this deep state has been hiding things from us for so long. So now that wing of the American political spectrum has the microphone very prominently, it's going to be interesting how they push this conversation forward just in general discussion circles. Will this permeate into all the conversation circles where it's just more comfortable to talk about? Is it socially acceptable to now have UFO conversations just at the workplace and not get a funny look or anything of that nature? That will be interesting. I think it could also backfire, to be honest. I think it could, it may not go in the direction that we want it to, and it could end up muddying the water depending on what is said. It could maybe decrease the credibility of the subject if the wrong things are said, or if certain testimony is given that, as you said, kind of pours cold water on the topic. So certainly interesting. We'll keep an eye on it, and I can't wait to talk about it. Obviously, want to break it down. Speaking of the lessening stigma, though, we do have some other things that are percolating in the media landscape with UFOs. We've got the George Knapp documentary that just released on Netflix. We've got the Manhattan Alien Abduction, a series that also is on Netflix. We've got the James Fox documentary, The Program, that he has said will be released before the end of the year. I mean, we don't have many weeks left, Darren, so that's very soon. And then we've also got some other things in the works that we know of. Our friends Jay King and Kelly, they're working on their product from Ontocalypse Productions. And then we've got something else, I think, from Leslie Kane. You know a little bit, maybe more about that than I do. So a lot of stuff happening here that is in the works and really getting out into the public sphere. So excited to see that content.
Absolutely. And I think people shouldn't underestimate the impact that can make, because one of the things that's become clear to me recently in conversations with people from government sources that are really trying to help push disclosure, the sense from those people is that, and I think this will be strange for some people to hear, that to really allow for disclosure to happen, it's not really fully about keeping knocking on those doors until somebody opens a door. It's actually softening the soil around government so that you create the context where government feels comfortable disclosing. That sounds kind of counterintuitive, and it sounds like it's giving up on the idea that government should be accountable to us. But I could also argue that it's kind of realistic. It's saying that government will do things when it is in government's best interest to do those things. So even some of the government and former officials that are pushing for disclosure are centrally involved. In my conversations with them, they've made it very clear that they see us softening the soil in general in our society is what's necessary for disclosure to really happen. And artistic endeavors like these series that are being released in pretty quick succession, we're having numerous ones coming out, that really does help because it helps to normalize it and creates more discussion in people's workplaces and around the dinner table and that kind of thing. Because I also want to make the point that some of those same officials that are heavily involved in disclosure, heavily involved in the Schumer Amendment, have said to me that part of the problem, believe it or not, is still that some Congress people are not convinced there's a there there. Some of these people still think it's probably just U.S. tech that's deeply in the black, but they're not convinced there's something pointing to non-human intelligence. So when people argue about what actually caused the failure of the Schumer Amendment being passed a second time, they often talk about some of these guys who are in districts where the defense contractors are housed and they're being bought out. But the sense I get from some of these guys is actually part of the problem is still convincing Joe and Jane Congress people that there's something worth paying attention to here, and it's not going to embarrass them if they get behind it. So I think that is a bit surprising to some people. The other thing I wanted to say, too, is that one thing that is helping here as well is there's a pretty strong citizen activism kind of approach going on with numerous different groups, New Paradigm Institute, for instance, the Disclosure Fund, these different groups that are really pushing for disclosure and are willing to name names, right? They're being very specific about who are the gatekeepers. So, for instance, Christopher Sharp recently in Liberation Times talked about this one person who he thinks is one of the lynch people in terms of preventing this moving down the field. So I'm going to quote something here. Multiple sources informed Liberation Times that these material transfer efforts were blocked by former CIA Director of Science and Technology, Glenn Gaffney, when he held the position. And part of that social media post also included this person's photo. So people are being pretty adamant about pushing at these levers of power and naming people and including their photos and that kind of thing. So that's something we didn't see in yesterdecades, right? When people tried to push for disclosure then, they were quickly silenced. It was much easier to silence them because there was only a few media outlets, and those were already being, to some degree, bought out by some of the intelligence services, and they were reticent to report on these things anyway. Now we have social media where as soon as something happens, it can be released. Names are being named. People's photos are being included. The specific defense contractors that were involved are being named as well. So this is new, and I think this is a major piece that we need to pay attention to as well. So while the hearing might not be that exciting, the fact that we have numerous different series coming out that are engaging with this topic and that we're having pretty dedicated citizen disclosure efforts really does make a difference.
It does. It truly does. And I'm going to be. I'm excited for this. I think that it's good momentum. I want to make sure that the community is also being very careful about what they're doing, and this is not, I think, giving folks a free license to harass people. You know, it's one thing to call somebody out and say that they're a part of, an effort to block the transfer of a program or whatever it may be. It's another thing entirely to find their home address and go visit them there, or call them, or harass them at their place of work, or harass their family members. These are things that are not okay, and do actual real harm to the cause. So if this is something that you really believe strongly in, doing those kinds of things actually does set the movement back. So it would strongly discourage folks from even considering that, but it is important, and I hope that we do get some names entered into the congressional record, names that would be worthy of follow-up by Congress to ask, and maybe even under subpoena power, ask some real pointed questions. That's kind of what I think we need to get to, if the will of the American people is there, if we can get our representatives to really hold some feet to the fire and get some answers under oath, whether that be in a classified or unclassified setting. That's really what we need, and to get some further tangible progress, at least from a public-facing standpoint. So very, very interesting there. But you mentioned sort of preparing the soil and kind of getting society ready to hear some of these truths and kind of digest them, metabolize them. And along those lines, that's what I think we want to spend the rest of the show discussing. And that's a recent effort that you and I both been very interested in and have been recommending in our social circles. And that's a podcast, a documentary podcast, which I think is going to also be made into a film by documentarian Kai Dickens. And this is a podcast called the Telepathy Tapes. You can hear the Telepathy Tapes on pretty much any of the podcast streaming platforms. I listen to it on Spotify. And as of this recording, there are 7 episodes, but I think there are more on the way. And this show, Darren, it certainly wasn't giving you and I things that we didn't already know, but it does provide further, I think, empirical evidence to point to the fact that the reality that we've been taught, the way that it functions, is not the way reality functions, and that there are indeed capabilities that we have as human beings that are not well explained by the materialist model, and we need other models that can better fit what we're seeing in actual reality and the experiences of individuals. And here, specifically, what the Telepathy Tapes podcast dives into are the lives of families who struggle with, highly autistic individuals who are, many cases, non-speaking autistic, and they have found, the parents of these individuals have found that whether by chance or faith or trust, that their children, who they've been told their whole lives aren't actually inside, that there's no person in there, that they're really just kind of in a vegetative state, and they can't do anything, and that they can't learn anything, they can't be taught, they don't know. In fact, that they do know, and in fact, more than just that they know things, but they can know things telepathically. And that's where it really gets interesting. There are a lot of experiments done in the series that are shared, and the results are truly mind-boggling, and I think really worthy of discussion, because they open up these doorways to facets of the conversation that you and I have been trying to have for so long, that I think point to the deeper structure of reality, which ties into this entire phenomenon that we're so interested in. But Darren, what was your take the first time that you listened to the show? I just dove right in, and I kind of binged the whole thing within a matter of 2 days. But what were your feelings as you're going through it? Were there a lot of moments you're like, yes, kind of like exclaiming, this is, you're glad to hear this on a really well done podcast?
Well, first of all, I want to thank Sharon Hewitt-Rowlett. She was the one that turned me on to this podcast. And in some of the circles I'm in where we deal with parapsychological kind of issues and whatnot, we were discussing the implications of this. And to the point you made, absolutely, what this does is it is very palatable to the public. It presents information in a way that they can understand, and they see what the implications are in real time. In fact, one of the most compelling aspects of the series is that some of the people that are even working the cameras and whatnot, and part of the tech crew, came in as physicalists, came in as reductionistic materialists, thinking that this was kind of going to be embarrassing or only confirm what they already thought. And in the series, you actually see in real time how she goes into a back room and finds one of the guys with his head in his hands because he's having to consider the implications of what he just saw, because they just ran an experiment which to him was completely above reproach and demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that these kids were telepathically picking up information, and not just from their parents, but from anyone, right? So we will go back and forth into all the ways that empirically this is shown throughout this show. And it goes even beyond just telepathy being signal-like, which is something I'd like to get into. So yes, what's fascinating about this and compelling about this is this really helps move the needle, so to speak, because it is so tangible. It presents information in real time, and it really makes you think carefully and seriously about what this must mean for the nature of reality. So you and I have talked many times on this podcast about Bernardo Kastrup, who of course has developed this model called analytic idealism. He's recently released his book that's kind of the capstone to this, called Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. But as you and I talked about in our conversation over pizza on Monday, this is not really the kind of book that's palatable to your average person, right? It's very much philosophy speak. And as a philosopher, that's one of his PhDs is in philosophy. He's really making arguments that will persuade his philosophy colleagues. It's not the kind of thing that someone on the street is necessarily going to pick up and immediately recognize the implications. In fact, you pointed out to me there are times you had to read a paragraph 2 or 3 times to grok what he was really saying and the implications of it. So as much as he talks about it being the book that will help move the needle, that he would point people towards if they want to explore idealism, most people are not going to be persuaded by that book. But a series like this, they will be, because it's so in your face. The implications are so apparent almost immediately. So that's something I would initially say in terms of why I think this is compelling and why I think it will move the needle or has the potential to, unlike some other sources we've discussed.
Absolutely. Kai Dickens comes across very much as a curious, scientifically minded documentarian. She's got a pedigree of doing other documentaries unrelated to any of this stuff. She is not a ufologist, not someone that's been studying Bigfoot. This is just somebody who was fascinated in the possibility here that this may be a thing, and she's investigating it. And as she's doing this investigation, she's bringing you along in that journey of discovery. One thing that I did yesterday as we were traveling to the high school football game, I put the first episode on in the car. I'd already mentioned it to my wife, and I said, you really got to listen to this podcast. I think you're going to enjoy it. But I put it on in the car. She was in the car, and my youngest was in the back. And by the time we got to the stadium, we just sat in the car and finished the episode. And they were really taken aback by it. And honestly, one of the things that I observed, because I'm very much into all this stuff, obviously, you know that, and everybody who listens to this show knows that. I'm very vocal about my interest in UFOs and the phenomenon, but my family members aren't really. They don't have time for it. My wife says, I don't worry about it because I know that you're worried about it, and you'll just keep me up to date on it. So she's very trusting in that I'm pursuing all this, but she doesn't spend a lot of time, studying this. And so when we started that episode, the very first episode, what I felt in my own body, my energy, was this awkwardness, right? This awkwardness that I'm exposing them to this information that I know, and part of me knows, is sort of cloaked in all of this stigma, this woo. I don't know if I can trust this information. But as the episode goes on and the information continues to be shared about these experiments that are being done, that energetic feeling really dissipates. And there was literally a moment towards the end of the episode where I heard her basically gasp and be like, oh my gosh, And that's the kind of moment that I'm talking about, how important that needs to happen, and everybody to prepare the soil for this larger conversation. And what precipitated that? There were some experiments that were shared in this first episode between Kai, who was trying to put together an experiment that nobody else knew the ingredients of, the components of. She invited a family from Mexico to visit Los Angeles. They rented a house in Glendale, and they had a camera crew. Like you mentioned, many of the camera crew were skeptical individuals, reductionalists, materialists, physicalists. They were just kind of along as paid camera folks. She also bought some materials, and when they got into the house, they covered up all of the reflective surfaces. They had a partition between this child, Mia. I forget what her age is, but she's not that old, maybe 11, and her mother. And Mia is a non-speaking autistic child, and the way that she communicates is through an iPad or a touchpad, kind of like a stenciled board that has numbers and letters, and you can point to the numbers or point to the letters to spell. But I think she's using an iPad where she can just type on the iPad, whatever she wants to say. So in setting up this experiment, they've got multiple cameras, multiple angles. What they're doing is using a random number generator on an app that they've downloaded, that they downloaded in that moment. They didn't bring it or share it with them in advance ahead of time. They ran the number generator. I think the numbers they chose were from 100 to 999. And they hit that number generator multiple times before then showing the number to the child's mother. I think the mother's name was Ileana. So they're showing Ileana this number, and then they're asking Mia, who's on the other end of the room, separated by a partition, to type out whatever the number is. Again, this is a 3-digit number. And over and over and over again, she nails the number perfectly. They conducted this experiment over 20 times, and she got it right every single time. Not even just with numbers, but also with images. So they showed her, I think, a photo. They showed the mother a photo of a horse, and Mia typed out horse, but not just horse in Spanish. So, this is very, very interesting evidence that I think, when Kai talks to her production crew, and you hear them, reflect on this on the episode, they're blown away. They're processing it. That's the best way to explain it. You can literally see that they are processing this information in real time and trying to slot it into some model of reality that they are familiar with, and there isn't one. And that's something I definitely want to get into. There isn't a model that most people can pull off the shelf and go, oh, I can fit this here. So, that kind of information was incredibly compelling, and I got my family hooked on this show, and I think opened up their minds to just how weird and wild and beautiful the world that we live in truly is. So, Darren, what were your thoughts kind of listening to some of those experiments, and what does it say to you when you've got people who come into this kind of experiment staunchly opposed to this being a thing, and they have this visceral reaction that really shakes their foundations? I think you've experienced that yourself, but what were you thinking as you were listening to that when she was explaining it in episode 1?
Well, there's a few things I want to say here. First of all, I'm glad that this kind of series exists and can move the needle, because the challenge is evidence for this kind of model of reality has been in place for over 100 years. You could argue 150 years. Parapsychological research that's very compelling has already been available. And this just speaks to the bias, the prejudice within science. Even scientists will admit to you that science is still being run by human beings who tend to be prejudiced and biased. And while we do think it's legitimate that science is conservative and doesn't want to leap to new conclusions, the bottom line, this is not new information. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects that came out of the series is that many of these experiences for these parents and these kids and these teachers began in the 90s, and some of these teachers would conduct their own experiments then that were empirical, and they would send the results to different scientists and different scientific institutions, and they never heard back at all. It just fell on deaf ears because there just wasn't, speaking again of this soil being prepared, the soil wasn't ready. It was hard, dry ground, and there was nowhere for that to grow. I also want to point out that this notion of reality, of this interconnected field of which we all have access to, is fundamental to essence of being. So my entire initiative is about understanding this about reality, and I experience reality this way. So I have seen how you can actually work through practices to diminish the amount of distortion that's in the field that you're generating, both yourself, your ancestral energy, your cultural energy, your familial energy. All of those play a role in constructing reality for us, but much of that gets in the way and causes distortion and prevents us from experiencing what's already there and has always been there. So again, this is tapped into in non-dual circles, ancient esoteric traditions, of course. But another thing I found interesting about the empirical research that was being done in real time is that, like you said, they used random number generators. They also used image generators that were random as well. And this is fascinating because you have to pay close attention to what is actually being revealed, how the kids are perceiving it, and what that actually points to. Because as I said before, this points to something non-signal-like. It's more like direct access to the field as a totality. So for instance, one of the images that's generated was actually really difficult to identify what it actually was. It was a smudge of different colors and whatnot, but it wasn't clear even to the people who were seeing the image on their iPad what it actually entailed. And yet the kid was able to say, well, it looks like a mix of yellow and green and red, and they were thinking maybe it was like relish, mustard, and ketchup, the people who actually generated the image, but they weren't even sure. And so it just shows you that it wasn't even a concept that was being transferred. It was literally the raw sensory data, and that was being interpreted by the kids. So It's really fascinating. And one of the other implications here is that, speaking to this notion of having access to the field in general and not just to a signal that's being sent, is that at one point, and I'd love to get your reflection on this because I'm sure this is one of those aha moments that was even more mind-boggling. At one point, one of these kids starts talking about understanding the plots of the Harry Potter books. And the parents say, wait a second, you never read those books. And then they say, no, but my sister did. So just the fact that that information is in the consciousness of the sister gave access to this other person to know it as well. Later on in the series, this one kid says, is that the book you've been reading, to his teacher who's become a friend? And she says, yes. He's like, just hold the book over here with it closed. He put his hand on top of the book and a few seconds later knew the entire plot points of the book. So this is almost like Trinity in the Matrix getting a download of how to fly a helicopter instantaneously. So the implications go far beyond being able to send a message like, I'm thinking of the color red, can you get it, Nathan? It's much more than that. The implications are much more far-reaching about the nature of reality and therefore who we ultimately are and what we actually have access to.
Right, and she does something that I think is really useful in setting the stage for priming you to be ready to have this conversation and accept this information. And she uses the anecdote of savant syndrome, and you get introduced in episode 1 to a doctor, I think her name is Diane Powell, who has a neuroscientist background and has been doing research in this area, but has suffered professional consequences as a result. But she's studied savant syndrome and this telepathic modality in autistic children. And Kai points out that we, as a society, generally accept savants as a very real thing that occur both now and have occurred in history. In fact, we have many examples of savants in the human family who often at a very young age just exhibit incredible skill in something that they've had no direct knowledge of. So they can either like play an instrument as if they were professional. They can speak multiple languages, even though they've never been taught a single language at all. They have an incredible mastery of mathematics. I mean, there are a whole host of different savant syndrome abilities that emerge in examples of the human family. And not only in young people, but there have been instances where I recall, and she doesn't specifically mention this example, but there is one where this man had a traumatic brain injury in his adult life. And after the traumatic brain injury, he became like an incredible mathematician. Like he had never been a mathematician before, no interest in math in that way. And here he was, after having suffered a traumatic injury to his brain, now could solve these incredibly complex equations and do all this kind of math, not just in his head, but kind of even advancing the field of mathematics in ways that people weren't able to do. So not a classically trained mathematician by any means. So her point here is that we have examples like this that the scientific community acknowledges are in fact real. Like these things do occur. And we essentially kind of stop the exploration at that. We say, well, they occur and I don't really know how this happens. Their brains just must be really incredible and they just somehow know this information. They can't tell you how they know the information, where it would have been acquired from. All that isn't something that they even bother trying to answer the question. Instead, they just accept it at face value that this exists. And her point there is, well, why is it that we have no issue accepting this kind of ability, the ability to know things in unconventional ways, yet we have a very difficult time accepting that something like telepathy exists and other psi phenomena exists, even though we also have stories in human history of those very same things happening. And I think, as you and I have touched on before, we've all had, to some degree or another, our own experiences with this phenomenon, on whether they be explicit experiences of direct knowledge, like a download as you describe, or more subtle experiences where you're thinking of someone and then they call you, or whether you're thinking of something like I have 2 very close siblings, and I have plenty of instances in my childhood where I was thinking of something and they were thinking the exact same thing. And it wasn't that we just, were talking about it. It just kind of came out that we were both interested in that. And so these are examples that I think we all can relate to, that there is something strange and unconventional occurring that is worthy of study. Yet for whatever reason, the scientific model of our day has said, if you study that, we are going to ridicule you, shame you, decredentialize you, and not let you be part of this conversation because we're not going to go there. And that to me is a real tragedy. And this podcast, I think, really highlights that we've got to rethink how things are done because clearly we've got something wrong.
Absolutely. And one of the people they actually briefly introduce in the podcast series is Rupert Sheldrake. And Rupert Sheldrake, of course, has been this outlier rebel within academia who's been exploring these things, again, empirically through research for decades. So, for instance, he's done research on the phenomenon of knowing that you're being stared at. So this notion that many people have actually experienced where you have this uncanny sense that almost like tingling in the back of your head that someone's staring at you, you turn around and sure enough, you see somebody who then quickly looks away because they've been caught red-handed. But again, according to a physicalist model, that should be impossible because it's not something that the physical brain should have access to, assuming, again, the consciousness is generated from the physical brain and is limited to the boundaries of the skull, basically. Rupert Sheldrake has also talked about and done research around pets who seem to know when their owners are going to come home. So they start exhibiting behavior where they go to the front door and act like they're expecting their parents, their owners, to come home. Now, some skeptics might say, well, that's just pattern recognition. Someone comes home at 5:30 every day. These pets are just responding to that. But to prove that wrong, Sheldrake actually mixed up all these variables, and yet the animals still seem to know these things. They were telepathically connected to their owners. And many of us who have pets have this sense. So with my kitten, Willow, I often work with telepathy with her because I know that it happens and I feel it and I experience it. And what I'm sending in terms of information, she reflects back to me in the way she blinks her eyes, right? So it's fascinating. And again, we have empirical research to support this. And what this is sort of getting at that we've been discussing in previous podcasts is that the brain functions, if anything, more like a transducer or a reducing valve. And I say reducing valve because actually when there are brain injuries like you're talking about, sometimes people's capacities increase. Sometimes their personalities shift, these kinds of things, right? So where we would expect, according to the old understanding of the brain, that these different sections do different things. So if you get an injury to one part, that part of your ability would drop off. Number one, we find that's not the case. The brain is very plastic, first of all, meaning that some other region seems to take over for that. But even that is not adequate to explain what's going on because, as you point out, sometimes completely new capacities come online that didn't exist before, almost like the reducing valve has been damaged, allowing more flow to come in from this kind of connected consciousness that is fundamental to reality. So the implications are just really, really fascinating. This also, of course, is supported in psychedelic research and whatnot, where what we actually see is that psychedelics seem to dim down the default mode of the brain. And in that dimming down, the aliveness of everything else in the field suddenly becomes available to the person. So we see different ways that this works. Same thing in dreams. Sometimes people are more likely to have precognitive understanding in dreams than in waking states, partly because the brain is in a different, more diminished state, which allows a more expansive exploration. And many people would make the argument that we're basically astral traveling, leaving the physical body with our consciousness every time we go to sleep. And I would really encourage people to explore that more. Another thing, though, I want to point to, and I'd like to get your reflection on it, is just the real human element of these stories. And you kind of hinted at it in the very beginning, because we want to point out here just how difficult and sometimes cruel these situations have been, because these poor kids are very intelligent, very alive, very present inside these bodies that don't give indication of that. And so what we see over and over again is that experts, doctors, teachers, different schools and whatnot would say to these parents, as you hinted at in the beginning, sorry, there's nobody really in there. The light's not even really on. This is basically just a vegetable. You're never going to know them. You're going to have to accept that sooner than later for your own benefit. And there is no way we can teach them because there's just no way they can understand. So rather than asking the question, maybe they just have capacities that don't show up in the usual ways, the assumption that was leaped to was they're just not intelligent, they don't have the capacity. And so what that basically meant is many of these kids, if they were in schools, were shown really elementary things like basic shapes and colors that you might see in kindergarten or something, even though, to your point, some of these kids are savants and have really, really advanced understanding. So I remember one case in one of the early episodes, that was really compelling. And it's an emotional experience to put yourself in the shoes of the parent, because there was this one single mom who was trying to raise numerous kids, hold down a couple jobs, and one of her kids was highly autistic, nonverbal, and she had been told that you will never know this child. So just let go of your expectations or your hopes. And she basically had by that point, and she'd even lost her faith because she had been a spiritual person, but she'd basically lost her faith. What kind of God would exist that would allow this kind of cruelty in my life, in addition to some other things that had happened? Now we're at a point where the child is 21 years old. So she's gone through his entire childhood believing that about him. And one day she's really at the end of her rope. She's really feeling like so beaten down by life. And she's exhausted from working 2 jobs. And she's almost wanting to collapse. And she has her head in her hands. And suddenly she realizes there's someone in front of her. And for the first time ever, she hears her child's voice. The first time ever after 21 years. And he says, "Mom, I love you." And this rocked her, obviously for numerous reasons. One, she'd never heard the voice. He expressed emotion. She felt it deeply. And then we go on to understand that actually, counter to what all the experts had said, this child was tuned into every thought she'd ever had, which actually made her feel a bit guilty and wrestling with some of the really defeating thoughts she'd had before, even about him. So again, this changes our understandings of reality, and it also points to the very human challenges that these parents have to face, because on each of these episodes, they explore different stories in different families, but we come across this real human difficulty time and time again, and many of these kids are so alone. And this points to what you, I know, are really interested in and want to discuss, which is that they actually found ways eventually to meet in the field, as I would say, regardless of space and time. But what are your reflections when you think about the experience of some of those families and what they've had to face?
All I can say is you're going to need some tissues when you listen to this podcast, because there are real moments, as you mentioned, that hit you right in the gut. If you're a parent and you're fortunate to have kids that are, quote unquote normal, you're trying to put yourselves in the shoes of these parents who are struggling against all odds to raise children that society has rejected. And everywhere that they go in our world, they are rejected and not given a place to be. And we don't want to see it, right? We literally turn a blind eye to this kind of thing because it's too hard for us to confront. And we'd rather it just be sequestered away in special schools or special places that we don't have to inhabit. And so when you have stories like this where parents have been at the end of their rope, have been experiencing nothing but frustration, and then their child breaks through, and not only breaks through, but in a way that shatters all understanding of the way the world, you've been taught the way the world works. It's not just destabilizing, it's transformative. And what I hear in this podcast are parents who are on a mission to get the world to understand what's happening. And I think in some ways, these relationships between the parent and the child and how they've been told their child really, there's no one in there and there's nothing to see, yet there is this tremendous amount of beauty and knowledge and capability that really is in fact there. It's in some ways a metaphor for the world we live in. We've been told that there's nothing to the world. It's reduced all to these tiny little particles, and your life doesn't really matter, and space is huge and infinite, and when you die, and that's the end of it. And And here, the whole time, there's something far greater than any of that is in fact real. And to understand that, to take that in, to live that experience of reality is incredibly transformative. And it's something that our world deeply needs, particularly now. And it makes you wonder, when you talked about Sheldrake and his experiments with animals and their capability here, and there were many other examples. We don't want to give them all away. We want you guys to listen to the podcast. But we too, obviously, are part of that animal family. And think about in times in our ancient past where we may not have had language in the way we have language now. And how were we connecting with one another and with the world in that time? What capabilities did we have because we had not allowed language to get in our way? It actually put a new spin for me, Darren, on the story of the Tower of Babel. I was kind of listened to that story and thought, okay, the world was really organized because we all shared the same language and we were able to accomplish these amazing things. And then all of a sudden we were confused. We were made confused, and all these different languages were introduced, and we were scattered to the four corners, and we weren't able to be as powerful as we were when we were united. And it made me revisit that story, not as a language separation, all these multiplicity of languages that were created, but rather just language at all. That before that moment, we perhaps didn't have language as we know it, and we had this incredible capability to connect with one another at a deeper, more fundamental level. And instead, we opted into language, and that has handicapped us ever since. So yeah, absolutely incredibly powerful. And you mentioned that there's an episode where they talk about how these kids can connect with one another across space. They literally can have conversations with each other, even though they don't live in the same town, in the same country. And the evidence to show that this was a real thing is that over and over again, these autistic kids would explain to their caretaker, whether it be their teacher or their parent or both, that they were having a conversation at a place called the Hill. This is something that they specifically mentioned in their typing or spelling to their caretaker. And that's where everybody gathers. They gather at the Hill, and that's where they can have this sharing of information, and it's an energetic kind of blending of different lives. And this came up over and over and over again, and literally led to real relationships in physical space between two autistic kids that basically fell in love with each other, but they really kind of cultivated that relationship in this third space, this hill space. So that was incredibly mind-blowing to me. Not that I didn't think that was a possibility, but just to see it manifested in a show like this with real-life examples that I think are very approachable. They're not woo-woo sounding. There's not an alien spacecraft. I mean, these are just kids, and we've all had experiences navigating life with kids like this, and how strange that is for us that are, again, quote-unquote normal, but then realizing, geez, maybe there's all this stuff in there that I have never realized. And, what have we done to these children and these families? So, yeah, Aaron, it made a huge impact on me. And that particular anecdote about the Hill really does have some incredibly deep implications about our capabilities and the nature of reality.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so many elements to get to in this, and sometimes it's things that are mentioned in passing pretty quickly that you want to dial in and go, wait a second, what are the implications of that? They're pretty vast. So one thing that comes up, for instance, is that not only do people and animals have consciousness and are able to communicate with each other across this field, and actually, importantly here, at a deeper level, they are that field, right? This is what we ultimately are. We are actually source consciousness having an experience from a certain vantage point, but we have access to all of that, is the notion here. Now, that actually stretches beyond what we sometimes called sentient beings, because one of the kids actually has all these stones, rocks, crystals collected in his room. And again, it's kind of passed over pretty quickly in that episode, but the implication, the way he describes it, is that it's not just that these sort of beam out a signal, but they have a certain presence to them, like he actually knows these things. So I know that even within Bernardo's model and in Don Hoffman's model, they talk more about this kind of access that sentient beings have. But in a lot of non-dual circles, the underlying understanding is that everything is consciousness, actually. Everything. The ladder that leads to my loft in front of me here is consciousness. The laptops we're speaking through, which raises interesting implications for AI and what might happen with that, right? A rock, as some people have argued, and I think Don Hoffman has pointed to this, it may not be that a rock is this inanimate, lifeless thing. It may be an artifact of our perceptual limitation, that we can't access the part of the rock that's much more than that, that is actually expressing consciousness, that is somehow has agency. But again, his point is that evolutionarily, we have developed an interface. That's what we actually are experiencing, not the world as it is, but this interface that dumbs down and reduces to icons on a screen, like a trash can again, being something people can relate to and go, okay, if I drag a document into there, it goes bye-bye, it disappears. The same way that when I toss a piece of paper into a trash can. But of course, that's not what's really going on with binary code and transistors and whatnot. But it's a dumbed down approximation that we use. So the point being, when you look at a tree, when you look at a rock, when you look at a plant, don't assume there's nothing there. Rather, consider the possibility that it's actually the limitations of your perceptual set that can't show you everything because it would be completely overwhelming, right? This is the notion that comes up a lot. And in fact, it's something I'd like to get into later, is that some of these people who do have access to this, some of the people I work with, are experiencing so much reality coming in from different modalities, different domains, different realms simultaneously, that it ends up being difficult to navigate this world, and they end up on the mental health spectrum because of it. Some of them have to medicate themselves to limit that flow so they can function here. So again, vast implications for many different topics, including what we tend to call mental health. Something else I want to point out here, when you talked about the hill and whatnot, is that, well, first of all, let me say this, that what's interesting here is we are seeing technology change our modern world, right? One of the ways that finally these kids were able to be recognized and understood as being intelligent beings is that these things like iPads have come into being, these different devices they use, these tablets they use where they can actually type out spelling, right? And one of the things that comes up over and over again is, again, to skeptics, they go, well, the parent's touching the kid in various ways, supporting their arm and whatnot. So how do we know that the parents are actually cheating and actually typing in the right answer kind of thing? But what's very clear is that that's not what's happening. And later on, for instance, some research was done where they actually just zeroed in on the eyes of the kids, and those eyes would point to the letter before the hand was ever going to reach for the letter. So it's very clearly coming from the kids themselves. But that's the first thing to point out, that if it were not for technology arising, we would still not know these kids are actually very intelligent and capable. Because the point here is not just that they are nonverbal, but very often they have very little control of their bodies. Sometimes their bodies seem to flail around kind of thing. So you can understand a couple different things there in terms of implications. Obviously, that makes it impossible for them to communicate even through body language in the way that we would, right? Nonverbal ways that we use to communicate, facial expression, bodies and whatnot. But on top of that, when you are kind of flailing around in a body, we tend to make assumptions, come to conclusions prematurely that that person is not even coherent in their mental space, because if they were, they would control their body differently. But of course, that's our bias because of our own experience. So really, really fascinating in terms of how we tend to be biased about these things. And there's still much more to get to. But what were your thoughts when you heard them wrestle with trying to demonstrate this to a skeptical public? Because at one point she made the point that even after their first couple experiments, she was told that those would not be acceptable in scientific circles for various reasons, because if there's any kind of touching going on in any way, then some sort of information could be passed. I know that Dean Radin has run into this time and time again and has to have protocols so above reproach just because, again, this is really, really hard to become palatable in the mainstream.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because it is incredibly frustrating. These experiments sound to be very thoughtful, very thorough. It would be incredibly difficult to influence a child just by a touch, to guess, numbers over and over and over again. And by the way, the method she shared with how they learn how to touch type is that they do begin by guiding the child's hand to the iPad or the slate or whatever it is that they're using. And so they begin kind of closer to the wrist, and they kind of eventually like move up to the forearm and the elbow and the shoulder, and then eventually they're not touching them at all. So there are plenty of examples in the podcast where there is no physical contact, but there certainly was in some instances. But I think the point being, these are experiments that, well, yes, they may not satisfy some in the scientific community, are so statistically improbable that they're compelling, beyond compelling. And not only that, because she brings this up too, and I think this was a good parallel to the world that we traffic in. It's not just that you have very compelling evidence with pretty thorough and thoughtful experiments, but you also have all this anecdotal evidence that has been received by this Dr. Powell person. She was getting email after email after email from people who just knew she did this research, and they were just out of the blue contacting her and saying, my child is telepathic. And they mentioned a place called The Hill, and not knowing that existed at all, not ever believing in telepathy. And one example she gave was a medical doctor who, I loved his email. He was like, against all my training, I have to admit that this is real. I mean, that kind of anecdotal evidence is evidence, right? It's a mountain of evidence on its own, in addition to what you might create in a laboratory setting. And as you and I talked about before with the experiments that Dean Radin has done, some of these experiments have been so thoroughly thought through and constructed that they exceed the standards of what a normal experiment would require as being satisfactory. So doing all of this work and still getting a statistically significant result that is above chance, and yet we have all of that, and the world is like, well, I don't know, that just seems like it can't be real. Like we've created this mental block to being willing to accept this when it's staring at us right in the face.
Yeah, absolutely. To your point, not only is it above chance, but we're talking about they get 20 in a row, right? Like it's just so beyond chance that it's kind of preposterous. Something else I want to touch on that you alluded to earlier was about language. So one of the interesting implications of this is that you recognize that we sometimes forget that there's communication prior to language, and that language is kind of a dumbed down symbol access that we use to represent our mental state and our emotional state. But that's not really how we fundamentally communicate. And so, for instance, one of the kids is able to, in one exchange, go from English to Spanish to Portuguese effortlessly, even though they never learned two of those languages in this lifetime. Some really interesting implications arise, for instance, when they ask them, how did you learn those languages? And they say, the quote-unquote gods taught me. And then they say, when did they teach you? When you were a baby? And they say, before, which is, again, raising notions about prior to this incarnation. They already had experiences with these beings. And of course, gods may just be a way that the kids are thinking about these things, right? Maybe if they're not taught about aliens, they're just going to jump to gods. Maybe if they are taught about aliens, they'll assume they're aliens and not gods. And I've discussed before on different podcasts and in my classes, this one friend of mine in California, she had a near-death experience when she was a baby and ended up swallowing too much Christmas paper while her parents were in the kitchen. She had a near-death experience, found herself on board a UFO with alien beings that she recognized, and she recognized them from eons before. And at this point, suddenly she came into an adult awareness, even though she was a baby in her physical incarnation. And so she's like, oh, thank God I'm back with you guys. You are my true family. I'm thankful that I'm out of that particular predicament. And then they remind her, no, actually, you have a mission to perform. Remember, you signed up for this. You were there to help people in that particular context that doesn't understand this fullness. And then she said, oh, that's right. But she was really concerned about going into this baby body that could barely turn itself around and was so limited. But this was a full adult understanding that she came into. And then she, of course, returned to her body. And sure enough, the events of her life that she recounted to me were were exactly the things she expected based on that encounter she had with those beings. So this is being hinted at again in this podcast and those kinds of things. I also want to touch on something that you and I were talking about before we started recording that I think a lot of people are feeling, and it has to do with this political switch that's just happened. I think a lot of people are really wrestling with trying to understand it. One of the complexities that I talked about in my Cosmic Awakening class on Thursday was that I have come across a certain contingent of people who are spiritual, who are motivated by energetics, who understand consciousness is central, primary, those kinds of things, and they actually voted on the right here. And this is surprising to people who are spiritual and energetically inclined that are more from the left and more progressive. What I'm pointing at here is that both groups are tuning into something that feels rotten in the world. Energetically, I mean. Not in terms of policies. I'm talking about something energetic underneath, right? Subterranean. Now, how people assign blame, where they think the problem lies, that involves critical thinking, and that's where some mixing up can come in and some false identification, that kind of thing. But what I want to point people to here is that the sense that people have, that energetic knowing, that kind of noetic knowledge, is real, and people in both camps end up picking it up. And that actually I would say that is a primary kind of way of knowing that was prior to language in our species evolution, in our species history. And actually it's our first sense, not a sixth sense, but it's our first sense, is knowing something intuitively about our environment. And this was a really important way of knowing what our environment entailed so we could survive. I also want to touch on this language piece a bit more, because one of the things I found while I was practicing the protocols that became part of what I now teach in Essence of Being was I was dialing to real granularity and trying to understand exactly how I was perceiving things, how they were coming into my awareness. And there were times where I was talking to this friend who was working with me 4 hours a day, sometimes 5 days a week, working on these protocols for like a year prior to when I started Essence of Being. And I remember one time describing information that was coming in, and I was seeing it like an interference pattern. So it was a conflict in the field that was arising in people's opinions, but the way I saw it was as an interference pattern. But then I caught myself and I realized there was a millisecond there that passed where I translated a non-visual experience into something I could describe visually. And what leapt to my mind very, very quickly was this interference pattern. But I realized in that moment that I actually was translating a sense ability that has no corollary in our mainstream understanding, in our conventional understanding. And this tells me that we do have access to this. And sometimes, again, we obscure our own ability to tune into these things because we're busy, we're distracted. Again, I would argue there are control structures that are trying to do that to us. So we lose our empowerment, so we're easily controllable, those kinds of things. But it just goes to show that we absolutely have access to this information. And one of the things that comes up in the show, for instance, is this idea that anything that's happened to any sentient being in the history of the cosmos is available to every other being. In fact, they actually go into this understanding that the kids describe, which is very much what I've described in Essence of Being and on this podcast, which is that basically source consciousness chooses to forget itself and take on a vantage point where it has novel conscious experience that comes in as new information that then gets contributed into what we might call the Akashic field, the Akashic records, so that from then on, any instantiation of source, which is to mean you, me, my cat, whatever, maybe the ladder on the rock as well, have access to that information. So again, the implications for what this means for reality and what we ultimately are is profound.
And what have we allowed to atrophy? Just like if you don't exercise a muscle, it gets weak. And that's essentially what I think has occurred here. We've given up using this ability and we've outsourced it. We've outsourced it to these other tools. And we've talked about some of this in the past, but it's interesting to me because you did bring up technology, how the things that we create in the world now with our understanding of materialist, scientific work often mirror in kind of like a fractal way these deeper capabilities. So this notion of worldwide connectivity, the internet, instant communication from one side to the other, that in fact mirrors this natural ability that seems to be exhibited in these individuals with autism, but also something that we in fact can manifest if we just exercise that and work that and spend time on it. And there are anecdotes in this show that speak to that as well. There are anecdotes where the parent or the teacher who's spending time with these individuals, who has never had a telepathic experience in their entire life, literally has telepathy. It becomes manifest in their mind, and then they can read the thoughts of the autistic child or student. So that tells you that in some ways it gets a caught ability. And there's a couple of anecdotes in the show that talk about this as well, where the parent looks at the child and says, and I found this to be so beautiful, but they say to the child, "I trust you, I have faith in you." And that in a way unlocks this ability, right? So it's this mental, we've talked about this so much, Darren, but it's all coming together really clearly for me in this show. It unlocks this deeper state of reality because we've assented to its realness. And that's what we're saying is important, is sort of fundamental to unleashing these capabilities. And the more and more that people get exposed to this, here I'm thinking in a totally unrelated context, but the hitchhiker effect. The more that people get exposed to these ideas, the more viral they become and the more real they become in the world. And this is kind of the age in which we find ourselves in. We're at the cusp of this tremendous age of discovery, but it's in fact an age of rediscovery. It's something that we've had all along, but we've just let atrophy and grow weak, and now we're finding it again. So truly, truly amazing. It's exciting.
It is, and it's exciting to see people stumble across this and the implications begin to dawn on them. Because what you pointed to there was a really fascinating piece, again, which people might miss if they're not paying close attention because it's just a couple of moments in the podcast. But yes, this notion that belief, acknowledgement, engagement with changes the nature of the flow of the information. And I've talked a bit of this podcast, and we've talked about it on Event Horizon as well, a notion like the Mandela effect, the notion that we actually collapse one reality into existence over another. Of course, this is supported by quantum understanding at this point. And the notion here is that as we as a society begin to grok this, consider the implications, and begin to experiment with ourselves and begin to use those muscles that have not been used for sometimes our entire lifetimes, suddenly that grounds us into reality and changes the fabric of reality itself. So consensus reality begins to shift because of that. So the implications are profound, not just for what we might do, but even how we might solve some of the problems we face. And in addition, the tribalism that exists in our world right now can be so aided by this, because suddenly we recognize that person that we see as our political opponent as a human being who's had these difficulties, who's doing the best they can in their own way to make sense of the world, even though there is distortion there. And so suddenly we recognize each other. We are seeing each other as facets of a diamond. It's namaste. I recognize the God in you. You recognize the God in me. Now, another piece I want to bring up here and get your take on this was one of the other implications in terms of the porous nature of reality, the notion that these boundaries are largely illusory, is the line between alive and dead. Because these kids actually report to their parents not only knowing their thoughts and the thoughts of everyone around them. For instance, one time they talk about you're in a public place and the kids hear all the thoughts, and sometimes go into a store and are looking around trying to identify who had that thought that I just picked up. But in addition, they often say to their parents, so-and-so came to me last night, and it turns out to be an aunt or a sister of the parent that had died. And what's interesting is then sometimes the parent will bring a picture of the relative towards the end of their life when they were looking quite haggard and diminished because they were close to death. And the kid would say, no, that's not who I saw. And then they would find a picture earlier on when that person was vibrant and full of health when they were younger. And they'd say, yes, that's who I saw. So not only are they encountering and dialoguing with people who clearly are not dead, they've just changed frequency or something. And these kids can access that just like the Greys can access that. And we talk about that a lot in this podcast. But on top of that, this notion of being diminished, of suffering, of disease, those kinds of things are obliterated. And what you see is kind of an expression of that person in their fullest expression of health. And this is how these kids encounter them, which of course has massive implications for how we think about living, dying, healthcare, preserving human life in this particular iteration at all costs, these kinds of things. So what's fascinating for me is that telepathy is just the beginning of what we encounter here and what the implications are in potentia for our civilization.
Oh, 100%. It's clear that this podcast series is very much scratching the surface of capability and hinting at the deeper levels that are there. And many times in this show, I'm thinking to myself, man, I would love to ask these kids, X, because part of there's a beauty to the show and kind of what they reveal, but they're also limited in the kinds of questions that are being posed to them, right? So the parents, you can see, have gone through this journey of their own, where the parents, just like all of us, have started with a very materialistic view of the world, even if that had included a kind of form of spirituality. But they've gone through a transformation as they've learned that their children have this capability, and it changes the way that they look at the world. And the parents themselves become more transparent in the process and more open to these more fundamental layers of reality. And that's very clear in how they speak about this. And it totally parallels things that we've heard, not just from contact experiences, so people that in our community that we would call, direct experiencers, but also in NDE. You mentioned that there's that NDE example of the child who had an NDE of their adult self. But we've heard time and again people with NDEs talk about how the world that they find themselves in after death is more real than real, that they could ask a question, any question, and instantly know the answer. And this is a common thing that is shared, that reality is just is like clear water, as you've said before. You can see right through it. And it's something that I've only barely glimpsed through altered states of consciousness, where I've kind of had that passing feeling that anything that I wanted to know was available to me. And even the way in which we think we acquire knowledge at all is wrong. We think we acquire it by, sitting at a desk and learning things and, digesting it that way. And it's not really quite like that. It's sort of a dumbed down way of learning and knowing. And this show and what it reveals, I think, point in a direction to say that there is a we've vastly underestimated what reality really is and what our capabilities truly are.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you and I have been discussing in the last couple of times we got together was that not only do we experience darkness in the world right now, the sense of overwhelm with these multiple extinction level threats that seem to be coming online, and that is overwhelming. But what it's also doing, and I've discussed this on Event Horizon as well as in my classes, what it's also doing is increasing the contrast that allows people to see the real potential we have. And in that desperation, sometimes people reach into gifts that they didn't know they had, and they start experiencing information differently. And I think this is all connected, by the way, to what we are seeing transform our world as we speak. So, for instance, when it comes to these kids being on the autistic spectrum, that is not just an outlier. That's not just a coincidental element. We have to reckon with the fact that why is autism exploding in our civilization? Why is it the case that this was not being tracked at all a few decades ago? Is it partially because we just didn't have the tools to notice it then? Absolutely. But everybody I talk to who's in these circles recognizes that just the numbers of people that are coming into the world that are neurodivergent, it's exploding. So much so that eventually we will be forced to change the world to be better adapted to those people, because they will be a considerable contingent. So these kids, right, that have been so poorly represented and understood in our society will eventually be a strong enough component of our society, a strong enough part of the demographic that's emerging, that it will change the world because they will demand it, and they will be a considerable portion of our society. And I'll just leave people with the notion that that is not just coincidental. Partly the conscious cosmos is involved in the way that it wants to interject new data when a civilization is hitting a dead end to open up new opportunities, create new harmonization, expand the possibility space so you can transcend divisions. But I would also bring in the notion of non-human intelligence, who partly works to augment and increase our species' capacity by working on our genetics. So my understanding from the research I've done is that that's connected to what's happening with neurodivergence in the world. And not only is that astounding to think about that, but I just want people to think about the possibilities that we'll create once we get past this period of turmoil in terms of what the next world could be like. Because if there's one thing I hear from these people that are neurodivergent over and over again, is that they feel like they've been made for the world to come, not this world. But their very presence in the world, I think, is giving way to the rise of that new world.
Yeah, if you're not shook by this, then you're not paying attention. And I think with the world mirrors what we do pay attention to. And so the stuff that we're experiencing in our world today clearly reflects what we've decided to make important. And it doesn't have to be like that. And we have the capability to make that change if we just decide to invest in a different way. And so hopefully this show can be a conversation starter. I think in many homes and many circles where people can maybe listen to this content. The Telepathy Tapes, you can find it at the telepathytapes.com and support the work there as well. This could be a real jumpstart to people, I think, starting to look at the world in a different way. But I think we are also encouraging people to take it that one step further, that this has dramatic implications for the world as it truly is, and it includes all of the phenomena that we are so interested in studying and understanding, and that there's a space for all of that within that paradigm. And so really appreciate our listeners coming along with us on this journey. I hope you guys do take a listen to it. Give us your thoughts on it. Leave us some comments on it. We'd love to interact on that. And we hope everybody has a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day and week, wherever you may be. Thank you again for listening to our show. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us always that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, friends, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phrames.